I am Michael Sartiski. That's right. I'm the president of Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. I would be editor for life, except I died 3 years ago. My shit, about time? Is that what I heard? Okay. Trust me, I feel the same way. Yes, David Johnson is off gallivanting in Albania, as Brian said, which is actually a vacation spot considering he previously vacationed in North Korea. When David comes back, if David comes back, you may want to pursue that line of inquiry with him. I'm very grateful to the people who have followed us all these years. Again, this being the 24th year of Cultural Vistas. The bound volumes on my shelf literally look like an encyclopedia, which is, by the way, why we founded an Encyclopedia NOLA. And yet, you know, in the early years, we really did agonize about running out of stories. And we were, it's like, what are we going to do? Are we going to have 6 or 7 stories for the next issue and 6 or 7 stories for the issue of that? I know that seems naive and foolish, but I'm serious. We were in a state of high anxiety about that. The reality is, now that we're nearly a quarter century into it, we realize we're never going to catch up. Okay? It's not a question of running out. And part of that is because we work forward and we work back. We published Ernie Gaines in the very first issue of Cultural Vistas back in 1990. Okay? And now with David Armand, among others, we have a new generation, okay, of writers that are emerging and making their mark and continuing to make their mark as we go forward. And what Cultural Vistas also does, as in the case of Mr. Rockmore, is find and make sure that works that have been lost in the obscurity of time are brought forward again and re-illuminated. You know, we had an event here a couple of years ago of I.O. Scott, the young son, now himself an artist of considerable talent, whose father is John Scott. This building is largely a shrine to. My purpose this evening is to introduce one of this extraordinary next generation of writers, David Armand. His second novel, Harlow, is just out, and for those of you who haven't taken advantage, well, the table looks almost empty, so maybe we've done well over there. He has both his novels, The Pugilist's Wife, as well as Harlow, here this evening. David teaches at Southeastern Louisiana University in Hammond, where he also serves as the associate editor of Louisiana Literature. He has served as a draftsman and a pressman at a flag factory. Okay, I'll leave that to you. This is an excerpt of The Duck Hunters. Is an excerpt, and you had to give away the duck, about the duck. Okay, right? Really? Really? You had to tell about the duck. Okay. All right. We'll talk to you about it. The good news is that's not actually the climax of the novel, okay? It's a powerful moment, but the novel's still worth reading, The Duck. Okay. So part of what we tried to do, and in the excerpt, one thing I do want to note is when David Johnson and I met with David Armand, when we present a work of fiction, we try to present it with a visual dimension. And we are very, very determined and conscientious. And this has been our policy for over 20 years. We don't try to illustrate it by imposing something on it. What we do is we try to pair the sensibility of the work of fiction with a form of visual expression, either that of a photographer or of an artist. some years ago when we featured Chris Segura, an excerpt from his trilogy of novels called Marshland Trinity. I remember we paired, this is 15 or 20 years ago, we paired it with paintings by Alison Stewart, in which she captured scenes in the marsh. And similarly here, when you look at the excerpt that we published, we included a series of photographs by George Yerger and Leslie Addison, which were not commissioned to illustrate this piece, but in our appreciation of their work and of David Armand's work, we tried to bring the two together with that correspondence. So, without any further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you those of you who do not already know this extraordinary young man, David Armand.
Okay, so first of all, I think I should mention, this is kind of one of the strange little things that happens to me a lot. Today is would be William Faulkner's 116th birthday, if you were alive. And the coincidence of that comes in, a year ago today I was at the Cabildo in Jackson Square doing a reading on Faulkner's birthday. So I feel some kind of connection between, maybe that's kind of arrogant to say, I don't know. I love Faulkner, I love his work. And if you read this excerpt, and hopefully if you read my novels, you'll hopefully see that influence. And so one thing I wanted to talk about, I'm going to read a little bit of the excerpt too, but I felt that it was sort of my duty to maybe not justify, but just explain the unique style in which I write. It's not very, I shouldn't say unique. I'm not the only person who writes this way, but it can be sort of off-putting to some readers. And what I mean by that is these stylistic choices that I make in my writing, and Michael and I talked about this over lunch at Parasols. I won't forget those roast beef po' boys at Parasols. But we talked about this as being a potential turnoff to some readers. And so I'll explain what I do. I don't use apostrophes in negative contractions, which is a Faulknerian thing. And I don't use quotations around dialogue, which is a Joycean thing. James Joyce did. He used a hyphen to set up his dialogue. And then I go a little bit further than that, and a reviewer called them, I thought this was a nice way of saying, he called them portmanteau words, where you take two words that aren't supposed to go together and you put them together. And so readers might say, well, why is he doing that? Why can't he just write it in a normal way? And, is he trying to show off? Is he trying to be different? And so I've been thinking a lot about that, because my book just came out a couple of weeks ago, and I was trying to think of a real eloquent way to explain that to people, because it is for a reason. It's never accidental, and I think it was Flannery O'Connor who said, it's okay to break the rules as long as you know why you're breaking them, and it's okay to break rules as long as you are doing it for a very good reason. And so, just fortuitously, I was floating down the river, where actually a lot of my novels take place in this sort of area. So I was in Franklinton at this wonderful new state park called Tickfaw State Park, I think. Beautiful park. So, and there's a river there. You can just float down the river in a little inner tube, very southern thing to do. And I was floating down, and every so often we had to pull out of the water, because there would be like a giant branch in there, or this, or the water would get real shallow at some point. You'd have to pull your inner tube out. It would slow down your progress. And all of a sudden it occurred to me, I said, wow, this is a perfect metaphor for why I pull all this stuff out of my writing, because I want the pacing to be quick, and I wanted to, and so I have like this theory that you could, because I write these very kind of Faulknerian sentences that are very long and kind of circuitous and maybe kind of hard to parse out, especially when I pull the commas out of them. But I have faith in my readers that they can do that. But that was the metaphor that came to me. I thought, wow, this is it. So I'm intentionally removing these things so that you're sort of flowing down the river of my prose. And that's kind of a hoity-toity way of saying it, but you're floating down the river of my prose, and you don't ever have to get out. You can just float from the beginning to the end. And I think I'm kind of right in assuming that works, because everyone who's read my novels, both of them, they're just shy of 200 pages, not terribly long novels, but everyone who's read them said the longest I think it ever took someone to read my book was 2 days. So it's a quick experience. And I think despite the long paragraphs and despite the long sentences, that lack of punctuation, I think, does something to our brains. We just kind of move through it. And people, hopefully, it's not a distraction, it's not a hindrance, it actually kind of moves us through. So that's my explanation of my style. So if you notice, and Michael and I even talked that he was afraid, he said, I'm probably going to catch hell for printing this story with none of these punctuation marks in here. And I said, well, look, I'll put them in for the story, because I do have a different theory that when you're writing an essay or a short story, those things should be in there. It's a different medium. In novels you have a lot more room to kind of experiment. But so we left it in. We left it this way, and so I hope that when and if you read it, that it's not a distraction, but it's more of just a way to kind of guide you through the story quicker. So that's a little bit about the style, and then this story. And I've been very heartened to hear that most people feel, even if they haven't been duck hunting, that it's very realistic. And I had this very experience. This very thing happened to me, and I'll say that was the first and last time that I ever went duck hunting. So a lot of this comes from memory. And this portion of the novel, interestingly enough, took me the longest to write. I have stacks this high of drafts of just this section that's published in this issue. And the rest of it just didn't really take that long. But I had to do a lot of research. I had to talk to my family members who continue to hunt, continue to do these sorts of things, just to get the details right. And then I was further heartened that a reviewer told me that he was surprised that I had taken that much effort to write that section, but he was surprised that it did, or he was glad that it didn't feel overworked to him. So hopefully that y'all feel that way too. Because sometimes writers can do that. They can put too much into it. It just feels too contrived. So Rich, I was happy that you mentioned the ending of the. I wanted to read the ending of the story. It doesn't give it away. It doesn't. There's no, because it's an excerpt, so you don't really. There's no big shock at the end. But I wanted to read just the last little section of it to you. In this, unfortunately or fortunately, because I was able to turn it into art. Really did happen to me. This happened. My dad took me duck hunting when I was probably about 10 or 11, and the same exact thing happened. So hopefully none of y'all are too squeamish. It's not very gory or anything. But, so I'm going to read this little section to y'all, and then if y'all have any questions for me, maybe what I'll do before that, even so after I read this, if I have time, just kind of explain how this fits into the novel, how it fits into the context of the novel. So I'll start right here and just read to the end. And somebody just wave at me if I run out of time, because I don't have any kind of indicator here. So, okay. While they wait for the light to break, the man shows the boy how to use his duck call, and he teaches him the different calls and what they mean. He says, it will likely take you a while to get them all down. Just keep practicing. I will, the boy says. And now already they hear shots from somewhere in the marsh, and the man and Leslie look up to see a scattershot V of ducks, myriad and skipping across the sky overhead, and then the man tells the boy to shoot as he starts firing off shots himself. The boy lines up the bead at the end of his shotgun with the moving black shape of one of the ducks, and he puts the bead a little ahead of the duck to account for its progression across the sky. Then he squeezes the trigger. His sprained wrist winces at the use of muscle, and the butt of the gun rams into his already sore and already bruised shoulder, but the boy doesn't even notice these pains now. Instead, he watches the black shape of the duck, which he has just shot, pirouette down and out of the sky and fall into the dark water, yet still vainglorious in its descent as its colors become clearer and more vivid the closer it comes to achieving earth and water and its own mortality. The duck hits the smooth brown surface of the marsh now, but it is not dead. It rights itself and begins to swim around in circles just in front of the blind, uselessly flapping its one good wing, its other blasted and hanging limp at its side like a piece of shredded paper. That's yours, the man says. Looks like you now, too, with one arm. And just to kind of back to the boy in the story has a broken arm at the time of this experience. which again also was the case when I went duck hunting. My dad actually sawed half of the cast off my arm so I could go duck hunting with a hacksaw. And then so like a few weeks later when we went to the doctor, he was just staring at me and my dad. He's like, man, you really have done your son an injustice by doing this. He's like, well, I just wanted to take him hunting. So this boy has a cast on his arm, so that's what makes this a little bit more complicated. But you just clipped him, so you have to shoot him again, he says. The duck by now, though, is circled more so that it's too close to the blind to be shot at. What do I do, the boy says. You're going to have to get out, Jim says. Pick it up and wring its neck. I can't do that. You have to. You shot it. Can you kill it? The boy says. I don't know if I can do that with this cast. Yes, you can, and I'm not going to. Now, come on, it's suffering. What about the dogs? We didn't take one, the man says. They're in the other blinds. Okay, the boy says. Then he puts down his fowling piece and climbs over the side of the blind and walks out and into the water and over to the circling duck now. The water is just under the top of his rubber waders, and some of it starts to get in and go down the boy's leg as he wades out into the marsh. The water is so cold it burns. He looks up at the man. Do it, Jim tells the boy again. Leslie walks over to the duck. It is tired out now and just floats on the surface of the water with its beak half open. The blood across its side and the pellet holes in its wing and the blood pocking the gray coverts there and its black eyes staring out and at the boy. Leslie walks over to the duck and it tries to snap at him and the boy almost falls back into the water. He hears Jim laughing. Then the duck flaps its wing, but it just beats against the water and the duck doesn't go anywhere. It is a mallard with a shiny green head with a white ring around its neck and a bright yellow beak. Its body is gray with specks of darker gray and brown. Now the boy holds his breath and he picks up the mallard by its head, the weight of it like a wet dish rag filled with mud, and then he spins the duck around in his hand. His finger is a garrote until he feels its neck break and the bird becomes limp and feels heavier now than it did before even. Good, Jim says, you're getting the hang of it. Leslie doesn't say anything at all now. His broken arm is throbbing now since he had used it to break the duck's neck, but he thinks it'll be okay. An hour later, and the boy is cold and wet and tired. He sits in the blind next to Jim, and he holds his 410 across his lap with one arm resting over the barrel, and with his good hand he eats an apple, but doesn't finish it because the taste in his mouth is of the brackish and foul-smelling water and air. The apple to him tastes much the same. It's been several hours since he shot and then killed his only duck, and since then Leslie has sat in the blind as a part of a tableau. And the man has not spoken much either, only shooting at the birds sporadically as they fly overhead. That's coming from the other blinds across the marsh, but save that, there's silence. At around 10, the man stands up in the blind and says to the boy, let's go. So they pack the john boat with their things, and the boy places the gunny sack, not even half full with ducks, across one of the thwarts, and then he climbs in, and Jim pushes the boat from the reeds and into the water, where they troll slowly out, collecting the hollow plastic ducks, and pulling them up and over the gunwales and into the boat. The other men, as if synchronized to some silent and omniscient clock, leave their blinds and their pirogues, too, and meet Jim and the boy in the middle of the marsh, and tie up to Jim, who hauls them one behind the other, and they slog over to the muddy berm at the outer band of the marsh. None of them speaks. The sun is high along the eastern rim of sky now, and as they approach the ridge, Jim climbs out of the boat and pulls it onto the flat grass, and the other men do the same, all silent. So,
That's great.
So I thought I'd take just a couple of minutes at a time just to kind of put that into a context. The book, Harlow, it just came out last week, it's my second novel, is about a boy who feels as if all of his life's problems are because he doesn't know his father. He doesn't know his biological father. And I should confess, I've gotten past the point of being shy about this. It's based on me. It's not an autobiography, but most of it is very much based on my experience as a younger man. I didn't meet my biological father until I was 27. And then I had my own little boy when I was 29, and that's when I started writing this book. And I was on with Susan Larson yesterday, and I'm on 89.9, And the guy who was on before me was talking about how ever since he had kids, all his friends told him, wow, you've become such a better writer since you've had kids. And that's kind of weird, because you think you have kids, you don't ever have time to write. And I thought, I wish I would have said that on my interview, because I think I've become a better writer since I've had kids, because you start to think about, or I started to think about being a good father and what that meant. And my father felt that being a good father was taking me hunting and being this very overtly masculine figure in my life, which left little room for anything else. There was no, well, Dad, I feel sad today. There was no Dad, I feel, and this is my adoptive father I'm talking about. And so I grew up thinking the same thing. I thought, if I don't know my father, or if I knew my real father, my life would just be so much better. And so I started to write about that. I started to write about this boy who's searching for his father. And the boy's name is Leslie. And Jim, the guy in the excerpt, is actually based off of my stepfather, who took me to do that same experience. And so in the novel, the boy meets his father, and it's not quite what he had hoped it would be, which is very similar to what my experience was. I feel like the last few readings I've done have been sort of confessionals about my life, but that's okay. I think that's one of the things that makes literature so impactful, is when people can connect with it, or when there's some sort of emotional element to it. So this boy, he finally meets his father, and then you get sort of the backstory of his biological father's life. You realize he made some bad choices, but he wasn't necessarily a bad guy. So I kind of like to make the reader feel conflicted about how they feel about somebody who abandoned their son for all practical purposes. And so the novel, this isn't the only hunting scene in the novel. The novel, I sort of do this Hemingway, I'm comparing myself to Faulkner and Hemingway. I do this sort of Hemingway thing where I'm just very concerned with these so-called masculine endeavors, hunting, fighting, and all these things that, and my father taught me that when I was a kid. That's how you had to, and I was always very artistic temperament, and he never could understand that until the day that he died. He always thought that I was just some kind of freak of nature or something, And so in writing about this was very sort of cathartic for me, I think. And I hope that when people read it, that they can kind of connect with that emotional. And the novel's not written in first person, it's not confessional, So if you didn't know me or my family, you could just think it's totally made up, So, but family members have read it and recognize themselves in it, and I don't know how happy it makes them. So that's the context of this, and so there are other hunting scenes in here. When he actually meets his father, they go boar hunting. And there's a scene where, we do that up there, where I live in Hammond. So they go boar hunting and they go quail hunting, and that was another experience I had with my father. We were quail hunting, and there was this giant bird sitting up in a tree way, way, way high. My dad said, "Man, look at how big that quail is! Shoot it, shoot it!" And this is like the first time I'm doing this, So I'm kind of nervous. I have my little shotgun, so I shoot it. And it spirals out the tree, and instead of being a quail, it was a hawk, which is an endangered species, or at least I think it is. And so, I was chastised when I got home with my mom. All I can feel sorry for, I'm a sad case, but because she thought that I did that on purpose, and I didn't know. I was like 9 years old. So that's how we learn here, I guess, in these parts, And so that's what my novel's about. And it does have a happy ending. It's not all darkness. I told somebody the other day, I like to drag you through the mud, but then I always pull you out and hose you off at the end. So it has a positive, I believe in hope, and I believe in redemption, and I think that that's what art should strive to do for all of us. Otherwise, where would we be? So do you have any questions? I love answering questions. People always have great questions. Yeah.
I want to know when you decided that you were going to be a writer. When did it come to you? Were you very young, or did it come later in life?
I was very young, and it was weird how it happened. I was probably in third grade maybe, and there was the Just Say No campaign was happening with Nancy Reagan. And, so that kind of, I'm 33. I'm not embarrassed to say that's how everybody thinks I'm like 15, but I'm 33. And so in the 80s, when I was a kid, the Just Say No campaign was real big, and they had a contest in our school for all the kids to draw a comic strip about, getting confronted with, trying drugs and how you would say no to that. And so I drew a little comic strip about that, and it won first place, and I got $100. And I remember the guy the place that sponsored it said, "No, don't go spend this on drugs." And so then they hung my little comic strip up at the fair, and my family, we all went to the fair and looked at it. It was up there, and I think that's when it first kind of hit me, like, this is really cool. It's like people see your story, and of course it's a different medium. It's a comic strip, but that's when it really hit me. And then so I would always just write little short stories, little poems, little sketches. And then it wasn't until I got into college when I had some really great teachers who just told me, "You're doing something right here. You need to keep doing this." And so I listened to them. And now it's just an everyday thing. Yes.
When you ask your son how he feels about it, and he is encouraged to say sad because he really wants to go duck hunting. And are you going to write about that as well from the other side? Because so often it happens on both sides.
I know. And I'm waiting for that day. He's about to turn 5 in a couple of weeks, and I'm waiting for the day when he wants to go hunting. And I don't know how, I haven't been hunting since this experience, and it's like a pretty indelible mark in my psyche. So I don't know. Maybe I'll find someone else in my family who can take him. And he loves football, so I've had this and that was something I never was really interested in until now. So I watched the Saints games with him. But it's kind of hard not to like the Saints. Yes, back there.
Both in your story and in real life, did you get to eat the duck or did you shoot the duck for the mere sake?
No, we actually did get to eat it. So it wasn't totally, and that was always the rule. That's like the Southern creed. You don't shoot something unless you're going to eat it or mount it on your wall or something. But yeah, we actually ate. There was a guy who worked at the hunting camp. I can't remember his name. I call him Luscious in here. And he made this jambalaya out of nutria. Some of the hunters went through the stream of canals, were shooting nutria, and then they pull them out. Y'all know what nutria is. So he made jambalaya out of that. And of course, my dad told me this is just regular jambalaya with chicken in it, so I'm eating it up. And how you like that? You're eating nutria. And of course, everybody just, it tastes just like chicken. So we actually did eat it, we didn't just waste it.
When you take your son hunting, for God's sakes, don't make him shoot a hawk, okay?
I won't. Yeah, I think I'll be very scared. I'd probably tell him, unless it was like this close to me and I knew exactly what it was, I would not look at that. Anyone else?
What?
Yeah.
Hi there.
Hello.
What's your next project? What are you writing next?
My next book, this always just kind of blows people's minds. Because I have 2 kids, I have several jobs, and my next book I'm already about halfway through, and it's called The Gorge. And it actually takes place at Tickfaw State Park. I went to that place and I was just like so enamored with it. And has anyone ever been to the Tickfaw State Park? Yeah. There's actually a gorge there, this big cut in the earth, and I thought, is this Louisiana still? We're still in Louisiana? Because you don't see stuff like that. There's like these 40-foot high walls, and on the other side there's clay. And so I started writing a novel about that, where the place is actually its own character. There are people in it, but the place is like as a big. And so I'm about halfway through with that. I'm hoping by this time next year to be done, and hopefully my publisher will be interested in it, and I'll keep trucking on the road.
What about something in New Orleans? Anything?
Well, actually, both of the novels, The Pugilist's Wife and Harlow, have scenes that take place in New Orleans. There's another sort of dark scene in Harlow where a guy works at the docks, and he has this kind of strange experience where he falls into the Mississippi River. And in my first novel, there's a I don't know, he was this guy in a wheelchair who would, if you threw money into his bucket, he would sing to you and tell you riddles. Have you ever seen him? So it's just a fascinating character. So now somebody has, well, he's in my first novel, and he, so that there's a scene in New Orleans in there. My third one, not yet, but they'll probably find, one of the characters will probably find a way over here, definitely. Okay, well, thank y'all so much.